High above the jagged peaks of the Alps in the freezing air of 1944, a formation of silver fighters roared toward Germany. The roar of their 12-cylinder engines vibrated through the cockpits, where young men scanned the horizon with intense focus. These pilots were flying the P-51 Mustang, which was the most advanced escort fighter of the era. They were escorting heavy bombers that were striking at the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Suddenly, the radio crackled with urgent warnings as enemy interceptors dropped from the clouds above. The German Luftwaffe pilots expected easy prey, but they were about to encounter a ferocity they had never seen before. The American pilots peeled off to engage the enemy with a skill that defied every prejudice held against them. The stakes in this aerial theater were incredibly high for the Allied forces pushing toward Berlin. The 8th Air Force had been suffering catastrophic losses during their daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe. Without effective fighter protection, the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator formations were being decimated by German fighters. If the bombers could not destroy the fuel refineries and factories of the enemy, the war would drag on indefinitely. The lives of thousands of bomber crewmen hung in the balance every time they crossed the English Channel. The commanders needed pilots who would stay with the bombers at all costs, rather than chasing personal glory. They needed a group of aviators who possessed discipline and nerves of steel under fire. Leading this particular group of determined aviators was a man of stoic demeanor and unshakable resolve named Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. He was a West Point graduate who had endured 4 years of silence and ostracism from his white classmates without breaking. Now a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Air Forces, he carried the weight of an entire race on his shoulders. Davis knew that his unit had to be better than perfect to prove that African American men could fly military aircraft. He demanded absolute perfection and strict discipline from every pilot under his command. His leadership transformed a group of eager young volunteers into one of the most lethal fighting units of World War II. But the question remained whether these men would be given a fair chance to prove their worth in combat. Critics within the War Department and the public had long argued that African Americans lacked the intelligence and courage to operate complex machinery or fight in air battles. The so-called Tuskegee experiment was designed by some to fail and by others to prove a point about equality. As the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group engaged the Luftwaffe over Europe, the world watched to see if they would crumble or soar. Would the systemic racism that barred them from opportunities back home prevent them from achieving victory in the skies over Germany? The answer came in a hail of 50 caliber machine gun fire and the smoking wreckage of Nazi planes plummeting to earth. The Tuskegee Airmen did not just survive the encounter, they dominated the skies and protected their charges with unmatched tenacity. They earned the nickname Red Tails because of the distinctive crimson paint on the tails of their aircraft. Bomber crews began to request the Red Tail escorts specifically because they knew those pilots would stick with them through the thickest flak and fighter attacks. The immediate aftermath of their success forced the military establishment to reevaluate its segregationist policies. These men had proven that courage and skill were not defined by the color of a person's skin. Before they could become legends of the air war, these men had to overcome a society that viewed them as second-class citizens. During the 1930s, the United States military was strictly segregated, and African Americans were barred from serving as pilots. Many military leaders cited a biased Army War College study that claimed black men were cowardly and lacked leadership ability. Despite these barriers, the push for equality was gaining momentum through the press and civil rights organizations. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People lobbied intensely for the inclusion of black pilots in the civilian pilot training program. This political pressure eventually forced the creation of an experimental training program. The location selected for this bold experiment was Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which was a prestigious historically black college founded by Booker T. Washington. The selection of Tuskegee was strategic, as it provided a supportive environment in the Deep South where segregation was legally enforced. However, the program was still set up to be separate and unequal compared to white training bases. The facilities were built from scratch at Moton Field, and the pilots faced scrutiny that no white cadet ever had to endure. Every mistake was magnified and every failure was seen as evidence of racial inferiority. Yet thousands of young men applied for the few available slots, driven by patriotism and a desire to fly. Among the earliest supporters of the program was First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who visited Tuskegee in 1941. During her visit, she famously requested a flight with one of the African-American instructors named Charles Alfred Anderson. The Secret Service agents were terrified, but the First Lady insisted on taking to the skies in a Piper J-3 Cub. A photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt smiling in the back seat, piloted by a black man, circulated across the nation. This single image provided a massive boost in morale and political support for the Tuskegee Airmen. It signaled to the country that the highest levels of government were watching the progress at Moton Field. Training at Moton Field was a rigorous test of physical endurance and mental fortitude for the cadets. They learned to fly in the PT-17 Stearman biplane, which was a rugged trainer that forgave few mistakes. The cadets studied navigation and meteorology and aerodynamics while maintaining the strict discipline of military life. They were trained by a mix of white and black instructors who demanded excellence in every maneuver. The washout rate was high because the standards were kept intentionally higher than at white flight schools. Only the very best pilots earned their silver wings and the right to move on to combat training. The pressure to succeed was immense for every individual cadet. The first class of pilots to graduate included Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who would become their commander. This initial group of 5 men stood tall on the parade ground as living proof that the barriers could be broken. They were commissioned as second lieutenants in the Army Air Corps and prepared for war. However, graduation was only the beginning of their struggle for acceptance within the military hierarchy. They were fully qualified pilots, but they had no unit to join and no orders to deploy. The Army struggled with how to utilize a segregated unit of black officers in a white command structure. They waited for months while the war raged on without them. Finally, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was declared combat ready and shipped out to North Africa in April of 1943. They arrived in Tunisia, where they were equipped with P-40 Warhawk fighters that were obsolete compared to German aircraft. The pilots faced skepticism from white commanders and were initially assigned to ground attack missions far from the main air battles. They strafed enemy trucks and supply lines while dodging intense anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Despite the lack of aerial combat opportunities, the 99th performed their duties with professionalism. They were learning the harsh realities of war while operating from dusty airfields in the desert heat. The first aerial victory for the Tuskegee Airmen came when Lieutenant Charles B. Hall shot down a Focke-Wulf 190 over Sicily. This victory was a significant morale booster for the squadron and proved they could hold their own against the Luftwaffe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the base to congratulate Hall and the squadron on their success. However, the 99th was still operating under a microscope and facing criticism from senior leadership. Colonel William Maumier, the commander of the 33rd Fighter Group, filed a formal complaint recommending the removal of the 99th from combat. Maumier claimed that the African-American pilots lacked the aggressiveness and air discipline required for combat operations. This complaint triggered a congressional hearing that threatened to shut down the entire Tuskegee program. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was recalled to Washington, D.C. to defend his men against these baseless accusations. He presented statistical evidence showing that the 99th had performed as well as or better than new white squadrons. Davis argued passionately that his men had been given inferior planes and assigned to missions that offered few chances for air-to-air combat. His testimony and the support of the War Department saved the program from cancellation. The 99th was allowed to continue fighting and was soon joined by 3 new squadrons to form a larger group. The 332nd Fighter Group was activated and deployed to Italy, consisting of the 100th and 301st and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. They were joined by the veteran 99th Fighter Squadron to form a complete segregated fighter group. They were based at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, which was a crude, temporary base near the Adriatic Sea. The conditions at Ramitelli were harsh, with mud and cold winds and canvas tents for housing. Despite the rough living conditions, the morale of the group was high as they prepared for strategic missions. They were finally given the opportunity to fly the P-47 Thunderbolt and later the legendary P-51 Mustang. The transition to the P-51 Mustang marked a turning point for the Tuskegee Airmen and their combat effectiveness. The Mustang was a long-range fighter capable of escorting bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. The pilots of the 332nd painted the tails of their aircraft a bright red to distinguish themselves in the chaotic skies. This distinctive marking earned them the nickname Red Tails, which became synonymous with safety for the bomber crews. The P-51 gave them the speed and altitude performance needed to challenge the best German fighters on equal terms. They were now the guardians of the heavy bombers that were pounding the Nazi war machine. Their primary mission was to provide close escort for the 15th Air Force bombing raids across southern and central Europe. Colonel Davis instilled a strict doctrine that the pilots were never to abandon the bombers to chase enemy fighters. This strategy was different from other fighter groups, who often left the bombers exposed to hunt for kills. The Tuskegee Airmen stayed in tight formation, weaving around the bomber streams to create a defensive shield. This discipline meant fewer personal victories for the pilots, but significantly higher survival rates for the bomber crews. The bomber pilots began to call them the Red Tail Angels because of their protective presence. One of the longest and most dangerous missions flown by the Red Tails was the journey to Berlin in March of 1945. The 332nd was tasked with escorting bombers to the German capital to strike a heavy blow against the Daimler-Benz tank factory. The flight was 1,600 miles round trip and pushed the limits of pilot endurance and fuel capacity. During the mission, the Tuskegee Airmen encountered the new German Me-262 jet fighters. These jets were significantly faster than the propeller-driven Mustangs and posed a terrifying new threat. Despite the technological disadvantage, the Red Tails fought bravely and managed to shoot down 3 of the German jets. The skill of pilots like Lieutenant Roscoe Brown and Lieutenant Lee Archer became legendary within the group. Lee Archer was one of the most skilled aviators of the war and is unofficially credited with being an ace. During one fierce engagement, Archer shot down 3 German aircraft in a span of 10 minutes. His situational awareness and mastery of the P-51 Mustang allowed him to outmaneuver experienced Luftwaffe veterans. These individual acts of heroism contributed to the collective reputation of the 332nd Fighter Group. They were proving day after day that they were among the elite aviators of the United States Army Air Forces. Beyond the air-to-air combat, the Tuskegee Airmen also excelled in ground attack missions against enemy infrastructure. They destroyed hundreds of locomotives and trucks and oil barges that were vital to the German war effort. One particularly daring mission involved an attack on a German destroyer in the harbor at Trieste, Italy. Lieutenant Gwyn Pearson and Lieutenant Wendell Prout flew their P-47 Thunderbolts through a wall of anti-aircraft fire to strafe the ship. Their accurate fire caused the destroyer to explode and sink, which was a rare feat for fighter aircraft. This action demonstrated the versatility and courage of the pilots in attacking heavily defended surface targets. While the pilots were fighting fascism overseas, they were also fighting a war for dignity within the military. The Freeman Field Mutiny in 1945 was a pivotal moment in the civil rights struggle within the armed forces. Officers of the 477th Bombardment Group, which was another Tuskegee unit, attempted to enter an all-white officers' club in Indiana. They were arrested and reprimanded for disobeying a direct order that enforced segregation. This act of nonviolent civil disobedience highlighted the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom while being denied basic rights. The incident drew national attention and laid the groundwork for future desegregation efforts. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen is defined not just by their combat record, but by their perfect discipline. For decades, a myth persisted that the Red Tails never lost a single bomber to enemy aircraft fire. While historical records later showed that a small number of bombers were lost, the loss rate was significantly lower than other groups. This stellar protection record made them the most requested escort group by bomber commanders in the European theater. The white bomber crews who owed their lives to the Red Tails often never knew the names of their protectors. They simply knew that when the Red Tails were around, they had a better chance of going home. By the end of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen had flown over 15,000 individual sorties in Europe and North Africa. They had destroyed or damaged over 400 German aircraft in the air and on the ground. The group received 3 distinguished unit citations for their extraordinary performance in combat operations. Individual pilots were awarded 96 distinguished flying crosses and hundreds of air medals for their service. These decorations were hard-earned in a system that was reluctant to recognize their achievements. Their success was a direct contradiction to the racist theories that had attempted to bar them from flying. The impact of the Tuskegee Airmen extended far beyond the battlefield and into the social fabric of America. Their undeniable competence and bravery made it increasingly difficult for the military to justify segregation. The returning veterans became leaders in the burgeoning civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Men like Daniel Chappie James Jr. went on to become the first African-American 4-star general in the Air Force. Their service provided a powerful argument for equality that resonated in the halls of Congress and the White House. They had fought for the right to fight, and in doing so they changed the nation. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which officially desegregated the United States Armed Forces. This historic decision was heavily influenced by the performance of the Tuskegee Airmen and other black units in World War II. The integration of the military was a major milestone on the long road toward racial equality in America. The barriers that Benjamin O. Davis Jr. and his men had broken down were permanently removed for future generations. The Air Force became the first branch of the military to fully integrate its units and command structure. The legacy of the Red Tails was now enshrined in federal law. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen is a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of overwhelming adversity. These men faced enemies in the sky who wanted to kill them and countrymen on the ground who wanted to silence them. They navigated a narrow path where a single mistake could be used to discredit their entire race. Yet they flew with a grace and dignity that commanded respect from friend and foe alike. They proved that excellence has no color and that patriotism is defined by action rather than heritage. Their roaring engines were the sound of barriers breaking. Today, the National Historic Site at Moton Field stands as a monument to the training and sacrifice of these pilots. Visitors can walk the same tarmac where young cadets once marched and look up at the same open sky. The restored hangars and aircraft serve as a physical reminder of a time when the world was at war. It is a place of reflection where the ghosts of the past whisper stories of courage and determination. The red-tailed Mustangs that once ruled the skies over Europe are now cherished museum pieces. But the spirit of the men who flew them remains a vital part of American history. The surviving Tuskegee Airmen continued to serve their country and communities long after the war ended. Many became educators and lawyers and doctors and continued to break barriers in civilian life. They spoke to school children and community groups to ensure that the lessons of the past were not forgotten. They emphasized the importance of education and excellence as tools for overcoming prejudice and achieving dreams. Their motto of "Aim High" served as an inspiration for generations of young Americans from all backgrounds. The example they set continues to motivate those who face obstacles in their own lives. It is important to remember the ground crews and support staff who kept the red tails flying. The mechanics and armorers and supply officers worked tirelessly to ensure the planes were ready for combat. These men faced the same segregation and harsh conditions as the pilots, but received far less recognition. Their technical expertise and dedication were the foundation upon which the success of the 332nd Fighter Group was built. Without their skilled hands turning wrenches and loading ammunition, the pilots would never have left the ground. The Tuskegee experience was a collective effort of thousands of African American personnel. As we look back on the history of World War II, the image of the red-tailed Mustang remains iconic. It symbolizes a dual victory over the tyranny of fascism abroad and the tyranny of racism at home. The Tuskegee Airmen did not end racism in America, but they dealt it a significant blow. They showed that when given an equal opportunity, African Americans could perform at the highest levels of human endeavor. Their story challenges us to examine our own society and the barriers that still exist today. It asks us to judge individuals by their character and ability rather than their background. The skies over Europe are quiet now, but the echo of those 12-cylinder engines still resonates in history. The Tuskegee Airmen flew into the headwinds of history and altered the course of the future. They were patriots who loved a country that did not always love them back. They fought for a promise of freedom that had not yet been fully realized for their people. In doing so, they brought the nation closer to its founding ideals of liberty and justice for all. Their legacy is written in the clouds and etched in the stone of memory. In the end, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is not just Black history, it is American history. It is a story of underdogs who rose to the occasion and surpassed every expectation placed upon them. It is a narrative of triumph that belongs to every citizen who believes in the potential of the human spirit. The barriers they broke allowed others to follow in their slipstream and reach heights previously thought impossible. They taught the world that the sky is not the limit when the spirit is willing to soar. The red tails fly on in the hearts of a grateful nation. As the sun sets on the generation that fought the Second World War, we must ensure their stories are preserved. The last of the Tuskegee Airmen are leaving us, but their lesson remains as relevant as ever. We honor them not just for the planes they shot down, but for the dignity they upheld. We remember them for the doors they opened and the example they set for the world. They were the knights of the air who rode silver steeds into battle against the forces of darkness. And they returned as heroes who had changed the world forever. The roar of a P-51 Mustang is a sound that commands attention and stirs the soul of aviation enthusiasts. But for those who know the history, it is the sound of freedom ringing out across the decades. It is the sound of Benjamin O. Davis Jr. leading his men into the teeth of the enemy defenses. It is the sound of a promise kept to the bomber crews who relied on the red tails for survival. It is the sound of barriers shattering under the force of excellence and determination. It is the whisper of time reminding us of what is possible. Let us never forget the sacrifices made by the men of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group. Let their courage inspire us to stand up against injustice and pursue excellence in our own lives. The Tuskegee Airmen showed us that true patriotism involves fighting for a better version of one's country. They proved that the content of one's character is the only metric that truly matters in the cockpit or in life. Their wings of silver and tails of red will forever fly in the annals of history. They were the Tuskegee Airmen, and they broke the barriers of the sky. From the dusty fields of Alabama to the flak-filled skies of Berlin, their journey was one of epic proportions. They conquered the doubts of a nation and the dangers of a world at war. They left a legacy that challenges us to rise above our circumstances and aim for the stars. The Tuskegee Airmen stand as eternal guardians of the American dream and the belief that all men are created equal. Their story is a beacon of hope that shines as bright as the sun on their silver wings. They are the red tails, and they will never be forgotten.